At their anniversary party, Omari watched his wife stand beside another man as if her marriage had already become a formality. In front of the guests, Zuri reached up and fixed Daniel's collar with slow, intimate care, her fingers smoothing the fabric near his throat as though he were the man the evening had been built for. Then she looked across the room at her husband, seated in his wheelchair at the edge of the celebration, and said, "Try to learn something." There was scattered laughter. A few guests turned away too quickly. A few others watched openly, enjoying the discomfort the way people often do when cruelty is dressed well enough to pass as confidence. Omari gave a single nod. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for dignity from people who had already chosen not to offer it. He did not raise his voice or break the moment by demanding that anyone acknowledge what had just happened. But the truth of the room was not what it appeared to be. The ballroom, the chandeliers, the polished stone floors, the catered celebration, the building itself, the holding company behind it, and the empire that had paid for every shimmering detail. None of it belonged to Zuri, and none of it belonged to Daniel. It all belonged to Omari. And what happened next would not be loud. It would not be messy. It would not look like revenge in the way people usually understand revenge. It would look like truth, finally deciding to speak. Omari had been raised in a house where hardship was never theatrical. When the heat went out in January, his mother brought out more blankets. When bills arrived heavier than expected, his father picked up extra work and said very little about it. There were no speeches in that house about resilience. No one paused long enough to admire endurance. They simply lived it. That was the language Omari inherited. Continue, adjust, endure, keep moving. By the time he was 32, he had already begun shaping the early structure of what would become Trident Holdings, one of the most quietly formidable infrastructure companies in the country. He built it the same way he had been raised, without performance. He did not announce his ambitions. He did not build a public mythology around himself. He worked, studied, noticed what other people missed, and solved problems more efficiently than men who talked 3 times as much. Trident did not begin as a $40 billion empire. It began in a rented office with 4 employees, 2 second-hand desks, and a phone line that worked only when it felt like cooperating. 2 of the employees were cousins. One had talent. The other had loyalty. Omari appreciated both. His gift was not charisma. It was clarity. He could look at a distribution map, a municipal service contract, a shipping corridor, a construction proposal, or a logistics network, and immediately identify the weakness hidden inside it. Not eventually, not after weeks of meetings, immediately. He saw inefficiency the way some people hear a wrong note in music. He understood how systems failed, where they wasted money, where they invited corruption, and what it would take to make them hold. He was never flashy about it. He did not turn his intelligence into a stage act. He fixed things. Clients returned. Referrals multiplied. Contracts became divisions. Divisions became subsidiaries. And before most people understood what had happened, the quiet man no one found particularly interesting in public had built something enormous in private. His uncle Ezra had been essential to that rise. Ezra was a retired attorney, 71 years old, with the mind of a much younger man and the patience of someone who had spent decades understanding how power actually moved. He was one of the few people alive who fully understood the architecture of Omari's holdings. He drafted the original trust. He structured the entities. He protected the ownership. He made sure that what Omari built would remain secure, private, and entirely his. Not because Omari enjoyed secrecy for its own sake, but because he believed the strongest protections were the ones no one thought to test until it was too late. Zuri came into Omari's life 8 years before the accident. She was beautiful in the way that made people straighten without realizing they had done so. Tall, poised, intentional. She carried herself as if she had learned early that presentation could become its own form of authority. In the beginning, she was warm in a way that seemed genuine because it was. She listened carefully. She remembered details. She laughed at the right moments. She made Omari feel seen, not as an owner, not as a provider, not as a man producing results, but as a person. That mattered more than he admitted, even to himself. They married after 2 years. The first years were good. Not perfect, but deeply functional in the way mature love often is. Zuri enjoyed the life that came with Omari's work. The private travel, the elegant dinners, the financial ease that never needed explanation because it was always there. She did not know the full legal structure behind any of it. Omari had never felt a need to explain the details, and she had never pressed. What felt like trust at the time was, in some ways, simply distance that had not yet become dangerous. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March. A warehouse facility under Trident's southeastern expansion had raised a structural concern, and Omari had gone to inspect it in person. He rarely visited construction sites, but when a system looked unstable, he preferred to see it with his own eyes. He was walking the upper level when a secondary platform gave way beneath him. The fall was 16 feet. He was conscious when they found him. In pain, struggling to breathe evenly, he told the site manager to call Ezra before he told him to call an ambulance. That was who Omari was. Even from the floor, even with his body suddenly altered, he thought first in terms of structure, legal order, and what needed to remain secure. The injury to his spine was severe, partial paralysis from the mid-thoracic region downward. The doctors were careful but honest. He would retain some function. He would never return to the life of movement he had known before. He would use a wheelchair permanently. On some days, his speech would take a little longer to catch up to the speed of his thoughts. Pain would remain a permanent background condition, manageable but never absent. Omari listened without self-pity. He sat in the hospital room, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the window. When the doctors finished, he thanked them and asked when he could begin working again. Zuri was in the corner of the room during that conversation. She did not cry. She did not reach for his hand. She did not move toward him when the finality of the prognosis became clear. Omari noticed it. Then he told himself she was in shock. He gave her the benefit of explanations that were kinder than the truth. He kept giving her that kindness far longer than he should have. The months after the injury did not destroy the marriage all at once. They hollowed it out. Zuri stepped into what she called management of the home. She took over the calendar, social obligations, staffing decisions, travel coordination, household events, and every other detail she could frame as a burden she was lifting from him. She made decisions without asking. She informed rather than consulted. She always described it as helping. And Omari, who was learning how to build a new life inside a body that no longer moved according to memory, while still overseeing a company employing thousands, let much of it happen. Not because he was passive, because he was tired in a way people often misunderstand. Not weak, tired. Deeply, structurally tired. Tired in body, tired in patience, tired in the private rooms of a man's dignity where pain collects and says nothing. Zuri began coming home later. She began speaking about his needs in the language of scheduling and logistics rather than intimacy. She stopped asking about Trident. She stopped asking about Ezra. In ways small enough to be deniable and repeated enough to become obvious, she stopped asking about Omari. Then Ezra had his stroke. It happened on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Omari was at the hospital, beside the bed of the man who had been more father than uncle to him. Ezra lay surrounded by monitors and tubes, his stillness somehow more shocking than any noise could have been. The doctors said he was stable. They were cautiously hopeful. But he remained unconscious, and the room carried that unnatural hospital quiet that makes even breathing sound like an interruption. Omari stayed there for 4 hours without shifting. There was nowhere else he needed to be. No meeting more important. No task more urgent. Presence was the only thing required of him, and he gave it fully. Zuri did not come. She sent a message. She had a prior engagement. She was sorry. Omari read the message once. He placed his phone face down on the arm of his wheelchair and looked back at Ezra. He would only understand later that this was the moment something inside him stopped waiting for his marriage to return to what it had been. A week after Ezra's stroke, a hospital administrator contacted Omari to tell him that a personal effects bag from Ezra's apartment had been delivered and was available for collection. Omari picked it up himself. He brought it home and placed it on the table in his private study, the room Zuri disliked because it felt too bare, too silent, too much like him. She said it made her uneasy. Omari sometimes thought that was because it was the one room in the house that had never tried to perform comfort. He opened the bag slowly. There were books, a pocket watch, a leather notebook filled with decades of case notes in Ezra's careful handwriting. At the bottom, beneath folded paper and a pair of reading glasses, there was a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. His name was written across the front. Omari held it for a long moment without opening it. Some truths announce their importance before they are even known. He felt immediately that once he read whatever Ezra had left inside, his life would divide itself into before and after. He broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from Ezra, 3 pages long. Beneath it were legal documents. The original Trident Holdings trust instrument, the founding charter, a private legal opinion letter confirming beneficial ownership, and a 1-page addendum Ezra had apparently drafted within the last year, clarifying what would happen to the trust in the event of Omari's incapacitation or death. The documents were precise, thorough, unmistakable. They confirmed in paper what Omari had always known in practice, but had never needed to see laid out so plainly. Trident Holdings, in every meaningful legal sense, belonged to him alone. Zuri's name appeared nowhere. Not in the trust, not in the charter, not in any subsidiary, not in any affiliate, not in the underlying architecture of any account or holding that mattered. The wealth she moved through daily, the comfort she treated as atmosphere, the life she had come to inhabit as though it were naturally hers, all of it flowed from a source that was legally and irrevocably Omari's. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in a square of cloth, was a brass compass. It had belonged to his father. Years earlier, during a season of uncertainty, Omari had given it to Ezra for safekeeping, because he wanted the few things that actually mattered held by someone whose loyalty was beyond question. He sat with the compass in his hand for a long time. The study was quiet. The house beyond it was quiet. Somewhere else, faintly, he could hear Zuri's voice on the phone. She was laughing. Omari closed his fingers around the compass. He called no one that night. He sent no messages. He sat at the desk with the documents spread before him and thought carefully. Not about what he had the right to do, not about what he could do, but about what he wanted to do. His father had once told him that a man was revealed by the distance between those three things. Omari had never been a man who reacted. The next morning, he sent an encrypted message to his private attorney, Mr. Aldridge, one of the very few people still alive who had worked alongside Ezra in the earliest structuring of Trident, and who understood the architecture of Omari's empire as more than rumor or surface fact. The message was brief. Omari requested a meeting at Aldridge's earliest convenience. The matter concerned Trident's ownership instruments. Aldridge responded within the hour. They met 2 days later in a quiet downtown office building with no visible connection to Trident. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When Omari left, a series of legal actions had already been set in motion. Documents already valid, already signed, already waiting only for his instruction. Then he went home. He ate dinner with Zuri. He listened while she spoke about the anniversary party she was planning. She was excited in a way she had not been excited about anything involving him in a very long time. She talked about flowers, lighting, the guest list, the program, who would be seated where. And watching her, Omari understood with perfect clarity that the event had little to do with their marriage. Daniel had entered their lives 4 months earlier. Zuri had introduced him as a financial consultant she hired to help organize household expenses. He was 38, sharply dressed in the polished style of men who understand visible status, and charming in a way that felt instinctive rather than practiced, which made it more dangerous. He began coming by the house often. He stayed longer than consultants stay. He had opinions about wine, seating, events, furnishings, vacations. And Zuri received his opinions with warmth, with attention, with the unmistakable emotional current of a woman giving more of herself than she intends to admit. Omari watched all of it. Not coldly, not indifferently. He felt it all. The pain was not abstract. There is nothing numb about watching your wife look at another man the way she once looked at you. It is its own kind of slow violence. But Omari had always been a man of disciplined observation. He carried the pain the way a man carries a glass filled too high, carefully, because the moment he stopped being careful, it would spill into everything. Daniel had a gift of his own. He knew how to diminish another man without appearing rude. In social situations, he answered for Omari too quickly. He gently suggested that certain conversations might be tiring for him. He stepped in half a second before Omari's speech fully caught up to his thoughts, on days when pain or fatigue slowed him. It all looked like concern. It all felt like replacement. Zuri never corrected him. Lenora, a longtime mutual friend, noticed the shifts and became part of them. She had known Omari for years. She had attended the wedding. She had visited the hospital after the accident. Omari had trusted her because she had been present during important moments. But presence and loyalty are not always the same thing. After Daniel entered the picture, Lenora began gently steering conversations toward Zuri's dissatisfaction. She framed Omari's condition as limitation, burden, a life sentence neither woman needed to name directly for the implication to land. She was never openly cruel. She remained warm, attentive, even kind on the surface. But Omari understood systems. And he understood that some forms of warmth were simply strategy with better manners. The anniversary invitations went out without his input. The guest list was finalized without him. The program was designed without him. The seating arrangements were discussed in rooms where his presence was treated as optional. It was not that anyone explicitly excluded him. It was worse than that. They arranged things as though his exclusion were simply practical. One evening, 2 weeks before the party, Omari entered the kitchen and found Zuri and Daniel seated at the table with a notebook open between them. A seating chart from the look of it. They looked up. Zuri smiled briefly, the managed smile of a woman interrupted in a conversation she had not intended to share. Daniel nodded pleasantly. Neither of them turned the notebook toward him. The conversation stopped while he was there. It resumed after he left. He returned to his study, picked up the brass compass from the corner of his desk where he now kept it within reach, and sat in the dark thinking about his father, about Ezra, and about the specific loneliness of becoming invisible inside your own home while still physically occupying it. He did not feel sorry for himself. That was the error everyone around him was making. They mistook his silence for surrender. They mistook his stillness for defeat. They saw the wheelchair and assumed authority had gone out of him with mobility. They thought circumstance had reduced him into someone who could be gently moved aside. They were looking at the wrong evidence. The night of the anniversary party arrived warm and clear. The Trident Grand was the kind of venue that required no introduction. High ceilings, cream-colored stone floors, chandeliers pouring light in all directions. Music soft enough to imply class and expensive enough to go unnoticed. It was the sort of room people entered and immediately understood that they were expected to behave as if they belonged there, whether they did or not. And every guest who moved through that room in formal clothes and careful conversation, Zuri, Daniel, Lenora, all of them, failed to grasp one basic fact. The man they were preparing to humiliate had built the system that made every glittering detail possible. Omari dressed with care. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie. He placed his father's compass in his jacket pocket and arrived earlier than anyone expected. For a few minutes, before the guests filled the room, he sat alone in the main hall and let himself feel the rare silence of a place that recognizes its owner. Then the doors opened. Zuri was radiant. That was the honest word for it. She moved through the room as though she had been born for exactly that kind of light. Her dress caught the gold from the chandeliers. Her smile was practiced but flawless. She made people feel welcomed, admired, seen. She had organized the evening beautifully. The flowers were perfect. The music was right. The pacing of the event, the food, the arrangement of the room, everything was elegant. Daniel remained at her side for most of the evening. He greeted guests with the relaxed confidence of a man already imagining that he belonged permanently in spaces he had only recently entered. He accepted the room's attention easily. He and Zuri moved together with the comfort of people who had spent more private time together than decency could defend in public. Guests who did not understand the situation assumed they were a couple. Guests who did understand looked at Omari with the sideways pity people think they conceal. Lenora stood near the bar in a green dress, watching the room with the alert satisfaction of someone invested in seeing a plan land correctly. Early in the evening, she met Omari's eyes from across the room. She held his gaze a second too long. He did not look away. She did. Then the moment came. Near the entrance, in full view of the guests, Zuri lifted both hands and fixed Daniel's collar, as if the gesture belonged there naturally. It was not hurried. It was not awkward. It was intimate in the effortless way that only makes betrayal look worse. Then she looked at Omari and said, "Try to learn something." There was laughter. soft, polite, sharp enough to wound. Omari nodded once. Nothing in him looked shocked. Nothing in him asked for rescue. He had been seated at a table near the edge of the room, not hidden because that would have been too obvious, but placed far enough from the center that he registered as part of the background rather than part of the event. His water glass sat empty too long. When the host asked guests to rise during one part of the evening, Omari was already seated, had always been seated, and no one moved to adjust the moment for him in any meaningful way. Zuri's speech came after dinner. She took the microphone with smooth confidence and spoke about gratitude, growth, companionship, and the people who come into your life at the exact moment you need to feel seen. She spoke about loneliness without naming it directly. She spoke about the kind of presence that makes life feel possible again. Then she thanked Daniel by name. She said he had given her something she had not realized she was missing. She said he had reminded her what it meant to feel understood. She said he was the kind of man who made life lighter. The room applauded. Daniel stood. He placed a hand at the middle of her back. He answered with grace about her strength, her beauty, her resilience, and the privilege of being in her life. He was very good at occupying borrowed moments. Omari's name was never spoken. Near the end of the program, the MC, briefly possessed by conscience, asked whether the guest of honor wished to say anything. A silence fell. A few heads turned, some out of politeness, some out of curiosity, some because they wanted to see what humiliation looked like if given a microphone. Zuri's face remained pleasant and closed. Daniel looked at his glass. Omari looked toward the MC and shook his head. "No, thank you. That is all." He folded his napkin, finished the last of his water, let his gaze move once around the room, the chandeliers, the floor, the walls, the faces, and gave himself one private moment of perfect recognition. He knew exactly where he was. He knew exactly who had built it. And he knew exactly what would happen next. He did not leave early. He stayed long enough to deny anyone the comfort of believing they had broken him. He said goodnight to the guests nearest him with composed warmth. He did not speak to Daniel. He did not seek out Lenora. As people began to leave, he found Zuri near the entrance and told her the evening had been beautifully arranged. She looked at him with an expression that hovered between relief and unease and said, "Thank you," as though she could not quite tell what, exactly, she was being thanked for. He went home. He sat in his study with the brass compass in his hand, and he slept better than he had in months. Morning came quietly. Omari was at his desk by 7. Coffee, documents, silence. Mr. Aldridge had known exactly which morning to expect. The legal instruments had already been prepared. The authority had always existed. All that was needed was Omari's instruction, and that instruction had already been given. What followed was not chaos. It was structure doing what structure does when it is correctly built. The first action took place inside Trident. A formal memo was issued through the company's legal division, consolidating all operational authority under the sole directorship of Omari. The directorship had always existed. What changed was not the law, but the practice. Marriage had created assumptions. The memo removed them. By 9 o'clock, management at the Trident Grand received formal written notice from the property owner, Omari, that the booking privileges associated with Zuri's Social Planning LLC were terminated effective immediately. The notice was concise and professional. No explanation was given because none was required. Daniel's firm received a separate letter through proper contractual channels. A standard termination clause. Clean language, legally routine. The letter came from a Trident subsidiary that had served as the largest client in Daniel's consulting portfolio for the last 18 months. Daniel had never known who owned that subsidiary. He knew now. Lenora's name surfaced on a pending request list for access to Trident's philanthropic investment division, a selective internal arm of the company that funded regional infrastructure projects. Daniel had quietly tried to open that door for her. The request was reviewed. The request was declined. No reason was offered. None was necessary. At 11:15, Zuri's attorney called Omari's office. He was asked to leave a message. He called again later. Another message. By mid-afternoon, Zuri called Omari's private phone herself. Omari did not answer. He was at the hospital. Ezra had regained consciousness that morning. The old man's eyes were open, tired but clear. And when Omari entered the room, they looked at each other in the way men look at one another, when words are necessary, but not immediate. Sunlight fell through the window at a low angle, turning the room briefly softer than hospitals ever deserve to be. Omari reached into his pocket and took out the brass compass. He placed it carefully in Ezra's hand. Ezra's fingers moved slowly over the metal, relearning its shape. Then he looked up at Omari. "Your father knew," he said. His voice was thin, but it was there. Omari nodded once. That was enough. In many ways, that was everything. He remained there through the early evening. They spoke quietly. Ezra asked only one question about Trident. Omari answered in 2 sentences. Ezra gave a small nod and asked nothing further. It was the most complete approval Omari could have received. At 6:30, Zuri arrived at the hospital. Omari saw her first. She had composed herself well. Her posture was controlled. Her face was calm in the way faces become calm when fear is being held back by force. She came toward him. They stood in the corridor outside Ezra's room, like two people who had once built a life together and had now walked it to a place neither of them had truly expected to reach. Zuri said she needed to speak with him. She said her attorney had been trying to reach him. She said there seemed to be confusion regarding accounts, entities, arrangements. She said they could sort it out if they just sat down and talked like adults. Her voice was measured, but beneath it was the tremor of a person who has leaned her weight onto what she thought was solid and felt it shift. Omari listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct the language she used. He did not challenge the way she still tried, even now, to shape the story around her own perspective. He simply listened the way he had always listened, with patience, attention, and without urgency. When she finished, he answered in the calm, considered tone of a man who had already spent a long time deciding what mattered. He told her their attorneys would handle everything properly and fairly. Then he told her he hoped, sincerely, that she found whatever it was she had been looking for. He said it without anger, without cruelty, without performance. That was what made it land. Zuri looked at him for a long moment. Her composure remained in place, but only barely. She began to say something else, perhaps a defense, perhaps an explanation, perhaps even an apology. But whatever it was, never fully emerged. It stayed between them, unfinished. Omari told her good night. He told her to take care of herself. Then he turned his chair and moved down the corridor toward the exit. Outside, the evening air was clear and cool. The hospital sounds softened behind the closing doors. Omari stopped beneath the open sky, where the last light was still fading at the edges of the city. He reached instinctively toward his jacket pocket for the brass compass. Then he remembered. He had left it with Ezra, where it belonged, with the man who had protected it for 20 years until the exact moment it was needed. That felt right. Some things are only safe in the hands of people who understand their weight. He sat in the open air for a little while longer. He did not think about Zuri, not really. He did not think about Daniel and the damage now unfolding in his professional life. He did not think about Lenora and the doors quietly closing around her. Instead, he thought about his father, a man who kept working when the heat went out and saw no reason to announce his strength. He thought about what it means to build something so solid that it can absorb pressure without losing form. He thought about the difference between power that introduces itself and power that simply exists, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Omari had always known who he was. That had never changed. Not the accident, not the wheelchair, not the public humiliation, not the slow erosion of his wife's respect, not the hand she placed on another man's collar, not the laughter in the room. None of it had changed the truest thing. And the truest thing had been sitting quietly in documents, in structure, in discipline, in years of invisible excellence, waiting for the right moment to be seen. It had been seen now, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Omari took one long breath of the evening air and looked ahead into the open space of whatever would come next. Beneath the grief, which was real, and beneath the loss, which was real, there was something else, something calm, something settled, something entirely his own. He felt ready. Not for the past, that was over. He felt ready for the life that remained, the part where a man discovers that what he built was never the whole point. The point was always what the building revealed about the builder. The point was always character, the thing underneath, the thing that keeps its shape when pressure closes in, the thing that remains after the room empties, after the applause fades, after the performances end, after everyone who mistook silence for weakness is forced to reconsider what they were really seeing. Evening settled around him. The sky darkened slowly, from gold to blue. Beyond the parking lot, the city continued. Traffic, conversations, private heartbreaks, private victories. Thousands of lives unfolding in offices, kitchens, hallways, and glittering rooms where people still confused visibility with value. Omari sat with that thought for one final moment. Then he turned his chair toward the car. The driver saw him, came around to assist, and Omari thanked him by name, the way he always did. Because that was the part none of them had ever understood. The part that could not be humiliated out of him. The part that could not be replaced. The part that did not vanish because someone else stood in the center of the room for one night and borrowed the appearance of importance. Omari was never the man they pitied. He was the man they failed to recognize. And in the end, that mistake cost them everything.